Good afternoon. Welcome to INSS and to the annual Arms Control Conference that we've held, I think, now for the third year or maybe fourth year with CAS, in partnership with CAS, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. We chose to open the conference this year with 4 keynote addresses in which each lecturer will give their take on the major arms control and non-proliferation challenges that we're currently facing in both the global and the regional context. Before introducing our first keynote, I just want to extend my personal thanks to Eldad Shavit, to Yoel Gojansky, and to Shimon Stein for their cooperation and help in coordinating the conference program, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Israel for coordinating and facilitating the participation of Irini Lemos-Maniati, who, by the way, is replacing the name that you've probably seen on the programs, William Alberg. I would also like to thank David Kanfer, Gidon Kafri, and Noam Ran for all of their assistance regarding all the many details of organizing an international conference. And of course, my biggest thanks to CAS, to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, for being such a wonderful partner in organizing these arms control conferences. So without further ado, I want to move to our first keynote, Dr. Christopher Ford. He is the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation as of January 2018. He's had a long career in and out of government, dealing with WMD, non-proliferation, and counter-proliferation efforts. Among his posts, in 2006, he was named Special Representative for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and was responsible for U.S. diplomacy with respect to the NPT. In 2013, he returned to Congress and served on the Senate Committee on Appropriations, the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, and the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. We are so pleased to welcome you to INSS as our first keynote speaker and look forward to your insights. Thank you, Chris, please.
I'm going to try to slide this little step stool in. Anyone who needs it later, remember that it's hiding underneath.
Let me just take my phone. Sorry.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Given INSS's focus upon sort of strategic issues and sort of bigger picture scholarly and geopolitical issues, what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about what might be called the politics behind the geopolitics of some of the state-on-state competitive challenges that we face so much in the world today. Forgive me for my autumn allergies. I serve in a U.S. administration that, while certainly in no way letting up on our fight against terrorism, is also giving special, and I would say long overdue, emphasis to the challenges in U.S. foreign and national security policy of competition from state adversaries or competitors, as the case may be. The U.S. National Security Strategy, very specifically in 2017, calls out the revisionist powers of China and Russia as working against the United States in a new competition for power unfolding in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Those are words from the National Security Strategy. It also flags Iran as a rogue state whose depredations must also be resisted and whose efforts to arm itself with first-class weaponry must be stopped. Though the National Security Strategy speaks of these three virtually in the same breath, I think most observers seem to assume that these three regimes, that is to say, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, Russia, and Iran, seem to assume that these represent three entirely different and separate sets of problems. And in many ways, of course, that is true. The PRC, Russia, and Iran are indeed, of course, very different places. They have hugely varied cultures, backgrounds, and individual histories. And so one should, of course, be careful about generalizing about them, and policies for dealing with these three need to have a fair amount of tailoring, if you will, to match the specific circumstances of each. But I would argue that when it comes to the core challenge that they present for international order, one can, for certain purposes, still usefully speak of them together. For one thing, U.S. policy towards the three of these states is not structurally oppositional. We do desire friendship with all of them, though we feel that such friendship requires that they behave like normal states. That means things like China giving us fair and equitable treatment in economic affairs, Russia not violating treaties and other international legal obligations, Iran not supporting terrorism, and all three of these states observing the rule of law, respecting the rights and liberties of their peoples, and not bullying, invading, or destabilizing their neighbors. That's what normal states do. Analytically, though, and here's my point for today, I think one can also think of them together in at least one sense. For the three can usefully be understood on one level as individual variations on the same problem. They are all examples of what one might call a modern ideologized grievance state. This is hardly the only relevant thing about them, of course, and one could not defend a rigidly reductionist approach that described this as being the only relevant factor. But I do think that one can learn useful things about them by analyzing them together, for they do share some intriguing commonalities and present some analogous challenges and problems for national security and foreign policymakers. In the broadest sense, these three ambitious and increasingly self-assertive regimes all conceive it to be their missions to upend the global order in the service of their own rather embittered geopolitical identity politics. This sense of purpose in the world on their part is driven in large degree by grievance ideologies that encourage belligerent revisionism, buoyed by dreams of restoring some lost glory, of which they claim themselves to have been deprived by malevolent foreign forces, specifically emanating from the West, and more specifically still, the United States. Now, what is a grievance state in this characterization of mine? I would say that grievance polities share four basic characteristics. First of all, a sense of self-identity that is powerfully rooted in a feeling of affronted grandeur, if you will. Secondly, they share oppositional postures to what is said to be malevolent foreign influences. Number three, they share a need for foreign enemies to justify domestic authoritarianism. And fourth, they share a revisionist sense of mission in the world. I would argue that there are strong causal and reinforcing links between each of those four elements. So let me talk a little about them. To begin with, the PRC, Russia, and Iran all have, and this is the first factor, they all have powerful senses of geopolitical self-identity that are tied in the modern world to a perceived history of grievous wrongs suffered at the hands of malevolent Western forces. In their conceptions, an innocent and blameless self, if you will, is relentlessly menaced by an evil, essentialized, external foreign other. In effect, each of these states ascribes to its own civilization a special, almost mystical essence, if you will, that is declared to be unique and of inestimable value, but which is threatened and must be preserved against Western corruptions. These kinds of narratives are common to the legitimacy narratives of all three of these states. Now, number two, all three of these regimes articulate a sense that malign foreign influence has been at the root of their own country's civilizational decline from some apogee in the past of world historical status, glory, and respectability into a state of weakness of some sort at some point in the modern era. The specific time frames vary, but this feeling of loss and the longing that is associated with a desire for recovery and repair and return, if you will, this is the core grievance felt by each of these grievance states. In all three cases, the feeling of grievance is notably exaggerated, of course, with genuine historical challenges having been nursed over the years by regime propaganda and political mobilization strategies into a world historical travesty in their own perception of great and even central importance to each nation's sense of itself. But artificially inflated though it may be, this sense of past humiliation, I think, is in many respects sincerely felt, and it is a powerful driver for policy. It has also left in all three of these states a powerful legacy of self-doubt that can seldom publicly be admitted, but which also helps condition interactions with the outside world, encouraging endless, if negational, fascination with and self-comparisons with the oppositional Western other. So the third factor, all of these three grievance states under consideration, they need enemies to justify their autocratic systems, in the sense that their ruling regimes lack democratic legitimacy of their own. Now, responding to this legitimacy deficit, all three conjure the specter of malevolent outside threats and ideational subversion, if you will, as a tool of domestic political mobilization to consolidate and to maintain their own authoritarian control. Through this lens, domestic dissenters are cast as the pawns of wicked foreign puppet masters. You can see this in the propaganda narratives of all three of those governments. And domestic dissenters are obstacles to the great collective vision and mission of self-restoration, if you will, in each of these polities. These grievance regimes cultivate domestic acceptance of authority in the present day, first by comparing traditional glories to some litany of collective national humiliation at some point in the recent past, and then by depicting their own authoritarian control as the one essential ingredient to rectifying all these problems and moving forward into the kind of future that they imagine that they have deserved all along. And fourth, all of these factors combine to give each of these grievance states a sense of mission in the world, a mission of rectifying those perceived past wrongs and restoring each civilization state to something akin to the past glory that it cherishes in its imagination, and the lack of which it has felt so painfully in its recent history. Because of the connection between this collective teleology and each regime's domestic legitimacy narrative, this is also a sense of geopolitical purpose that demands results. Without being able to claim some degree of success in producing victories against the foreign other, each autocracy might be unable to justify its own existence. So it is this sense, this self-ascribed sense of mission in willfully changing and challenging the existing global order to their advantage, and their inherent distaste for the prevailing international rule set and their willingness to use coercion and potentially even force to effect that change. This makes these grievance states inherently and inescapably revisionist, and their modern approach to international relations so problematic and so destabilizing. The grievance aspects of their political personality are thus causally linked to their geopolitical self-assertion, and thus also to some of the more problematically ambivalent ways that these three states have all approached, and here we get to my favorite topic, non-proliferation. Now, all of this deserves treatment well beyond what I can give it here. And as I often do, I have greatly overwritten my remarks, and so I have multiple pages I'm going to cut out to spare you of all of that. But I would like to briefly list some of the ways in which each of these three states, I think, meets the criteria of a grievance state as I have described them. First of all, with respect to the PRC, it clearly has a sense of historical loss in suffering perceived humiliations at Western and Japanese hands in the 19th and early 20th century. It has a sense of mission, of recovery, or of return to some vague position of first-order global status that drives how it approaches its relationships in the world today. It has an increasing willingness to act aggressively to this end, and it also has a notable degree to which its ruling regime has grounded its own domestic legitimacy narrative in being able to demonstrate results in this great project of national restoration. And finally, it also shares this is part of the driver for its resulting fixation upon zero-sum relative positioning vis-a-vis an essentialized foreign other in the form of the United States. So I think China, for that reason, very much fits the description of a grievance state. As for Russia, it is also, I think, a grievance state, and its political iconography is filled with notions of special status and historical mission, coupled with bitterness towards an outside world that it has conspired, in its view, to corrupt Russia's essence and keep the country down, or perhaps even destroy it. This Russian vision of the world is, I think, perhaps darker and uglier than that of the Chinese regime, but Moscow is no less obsessed with perceived grievance than is Beijing, and perhaps even more so, given Russia's continuing demographic and socioeconomic weakness and dysfunction. The key themes of Russia's modern ideologized self-perceptions are thus intertwined. A sense of identity, obsessed by endless cycles of existential foreign threat, a feeling of mission and a taste for perhaps martyrdom, if you will, in resisting and even perhaps saving humanity from such evils, a mystical conception of civilizational purity, and you see this increasingly in the narratives of the Putin regime, of civilizational purity that must be preserved against malign foreign influences and foreign values, including by the maintenance of strongman rule at home, which of course also points to those threats to justify its own strongman character. A nostalgia for lost glory that can be regained through heroic effort and a willingness to take dramatic risks. These kinds of things it shares in many ways with the other grievance states, and having defined itself on this conceptual terrain, it's easy to see how the Putin regime falls into the grievance state category. Let me turn quickly to Iran. It's the weakest of these grievance states in geopolitical power, but I think it still follows the same ideological pattern. Within the broader universe of political Islamism, the specifically Shiite Islamist ideology of the Iranian regime was formed in a kind of a dialectical conversation with and in opposition to the West, very specifically and very emphatically. Narratives of Westoxification, if you've done your background reading on the development of Iranian ideology, making it what Hamid Dabashi has called, I think very aptly, a theology of discontent that culminated in Ayatollah Khomeini's success in deploying the imagination of collective shame, again I owe that to Dabashi, as a political tool to justify a sort of recombination of pre-existing political and juridical elements into a new ideology to form the basis of a new revolutionary regime. In its aspiration to fight back against the perceived threat of foreign corruptions and to achieve a theocratic and nationalist restoration of idealized past glory, power, status, and self-worth, the Islamist ideology of the IRI has made Iran, I think, very conspicuously into a grievance state. Now, what does this all mean? Probably many things, I guess, but let me look at non-proliferation specifically. And I think the basic problem that revisionist grievance states present is precisely their revisionism. They are opposed to the international status quo in critical ways, and it's one of their defining characteristics. Their geopolitics are, I think, inescapably revisionist. This does not necessarily mean that revisionist grievance states are in favor of proliferation. Indeed, I think if you eye the global world around you with hungrily revisionist eyes, you probably are not going to be very interested in having a rival obtain the kinds of tools that non-proliferation policy seeks to prevent the spread of. But nevertheless, I think the track record for both the PRC, well, for the PRC, Russia, and Iran is pretty clear. Things like non-proliferation and disarmament that most of us in the rest of the world take very, very seriously indeed are for them serious but conditional values, which must not be permitted, if they were to conflict, to stand in the way of their regime's overriding mission of acquiring the power and status that they feel the world owes them. I take the example of the PRC. One hopes that Beijing has forever put behind it the kind of mad revolutionary enthusiasms of Mao Zedong, as well as his fervent ideological opposition to the very idea of non-proliferation. But China remains notably ambivalent about non-proliferation and disarmament when it is not confronted with a strategic reason to observe such norms. As is documented through a wide range of open source reporting for decades, China supported proliferation, not merely through secret sales of nuclear reactors and ballistic missiles, but even through the transfer of nuclear weapons design information. The scale of these activities, thankfully, decreased after the PRC joined the NPT in 1992. But nevertheless, in more recent years, Beijing still appears to feel itself to have reasons to support, or at least to condone, proliferation to the degree that the spread of WMD-related and missile capabilities to particular recipients can be relied upon to complicate the strategy and undermine the security of those who China considers to be potential geopolitical adversaries. One does not see Chinese entities needing to be sanctioned, for example, for providing sensitive materials or components to, say, India's ballistic missile or nuclear programs. You do not see Chinese entities needing to be sanctioned for inadvertently providing materials to Taiwan's missile programs or something like that, nor, of course, to the US itself. These things simply don't happen. But yet, despite modern China's powerful mechanisms of surveillance and control domestically, you do frequently see Chinese entities continue to ship things to Iran's missile program in ways that threaten US interests and regional stability in the Middle East, or to ship things to Pakistan's efforts to target China's traditional regional or new regional rival in India. It's hard to see either of those things as a complete coincidence. As I've made clear myself many times, the PRC still remains the supplier of choice for many of the world's proliferators, especially with respect to missile technology. It's not always a poor non-proliferation partner, but it frequently is, and numerous and significant chronic problems remain unaddressed. For present purposes, it is noteworthy that the PRC's ambivalence, I would argue, is connected organically to its rejuvenation-obsessed revisionist geopolitics. You can also see a notable ambivalence about proliferation in Russia, modern Russia, spurred by its desire to both to protect its chemical weapons using Syrian proxy, for example, and also to evade its own accountability for using a Novichok chemical agent as well as radioactive poison, polonium-210, in assassination attempts on British soil. The Russian regime has now become the ringleader of a diplomatic campaign to undermine international mechanisms of weapons of mass destruction-related transparency and accountability at the UN, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, to be sure, Moscow probably still wishes to avoid the further proliferation of at least nuclear weapons. But this has not kept Moscow from such proliferation problematic steps as agreeing in as early as 1992 to build a nuclear reactor in Iran, at a time when concerns were growing about Iran's likely pursuit of nuclear weaponry. Indeed, in 2014, a point when Iran was building up its nuclear program quite fast and producing highly enriched uranium in flagrant violation of legally binding obligations under UN Security Council resolutions, Russia agreed to provide Iran with as many as 8 additional nuclear reactors. This remarkably cavalier approach becomes easier to understand, however, in light of Moscow's obvious prioritization of non-proliferation behind its own revisionist agenda in the Middle East. As the scholar Angela Stent quoted a Russian diplomat making painfully clear, a pro-American Iran is far more dangerous to us than a nuclear Iran. So on the whole, Russia clearly approaches non-proliferation norms with a good deal of ambivalence. Such principles are, it would appear, important when they are useful to Russia in fulfilling its revisionist mission, but can be disregarded otherwise. This is troubling, but at least that ambivalence is fairly clear from the public record. Less well known is the degree to which the ideologized character of modern Russia as a grievance state has spread into Russia's approach to its own nuclear weapons, though these developments surely bode ill for any kind of global nuclear disarmament of the sort to which Russia remains, in theory, at least, still committed through the NPT. Such weapons are clearly, in Russian writings, described as being the centerpiece of Moscow's security strategy against the more advanced countries of the United States and China. And they remain the symbolic coinage of superpower status, notwithstanding modern Russia's demographic, cultural, and political dysfunction and decline. Their commitment to these things includes, of course, such destabilizing weapons as we see Vladimir Putin boasting of last year with his famous video of the remarkable new bestiary of destabilizing new delivery systems, such as the flying Chernobyl of the Budavestnik device, which apparently sat on the seafloor off the coast of Russia for about a year before going critical when pulled up out of the water and causing a terrible accident there that they, of course, immediately tried to cover up. These are not, incidental features of where Russia is going. They have a remarkably deep commitment, and in some ways, as Dmitry Adamski has demonstrated with some very interesting recent scholarship, in some respect, an almost theologized attachment to these weapons. Very interesting, but very disturbing developments of which we should keep ourselves very closely aware. Final problem from the Russian perspective is, and the way in which their revisionism affects the non-proliferation universe can be seen most dramatically in Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, inherited a large arsenal of former Soviet weapons, and it is one of the signal accomplishments of the modern era that Ukraine was persuaded to relinquish those weapons, largely on the strength of Russia's commitments to the territorial integrity of its borders. And we all know what happened with that. The message that Russian revisionism and its inability to stop itself from trying to relitigate the territorial settlements at the end of the Cold War has thus sent a terribly, terribly damaging signal to the non-proliferation regime by suggesting the possibility that it is safer, in fact, to retain such weapons than to relinquish them. That is a terrible message that we should all regret Russia having sent. Its interventions in Ukraine thus have threatened the global non-proliferation regime and the world's hopes for eventual disarmament in very dramatic ways. Now, I know I've taken a lot of time. Let me mention Iran very quickly to finish up. Not shockingly, Iranian revisionism, of course, is also deeply tied to proliferation challenges that the international community has to face now. Notwithstanding its status as a state party to the NPT, the Iranian regime, of course, began to seek nuclear weapons during its war with Iraq in the mid-1980s. Acquiring enrichment technology from abroad, the Iranians began a secret weapons development program and a fissile material production capability that could ultimately provide it with weapons-usable uranium and plutonium. To be sure, it did suspend its coordinated nuclear weapons program in 2003, but it secretly preserved detailed records of this work, and its future trajectory, of course, remains highly uncertain today. Nobody here needs me to describe the other ways in which Iranian revisionism is destabilizing the Middle East, but it's worth remembering that these are not separate questions. They are all, I think, in some ways integrally tied together. The key point is that from our understanding of grievance states is simply that these Iranian actions are not, in that sense, that surprising, with an explicitly revolutionary geopolitical agenda and a legitimacy narrative that is grounded in oppositional stances to the physical and ideological power of both East and West, not to mention of Israel and the Sunni monarchies of its own neighborhood. The Iranian regime is profoundly and I think perhaps inescapably revisionist, and its behaviors are intentionally destabilizing. Now, this doesn't mean that one can never talk with grievance states or negotiate with them or work deals with them. We certainly hope to in all three cases. It just means it is really hard. The challenges that they present to the world are profound. Their behavior presents very serious challenges, and what the international community precisely needs to do in coping with these challenges is one of the core questions for U.S. competitive strategy in the modern world, and not just for the United States. Their grievance-infused geopolitics help drive them to exert themselves against U.S. interests and against those of our friends and allies, and indeed against the structure and function of the modern international order as a whole. This requires counter-strategies, and that's one of the things that we are devoting ourselves to very carefully and closely in the United States. Our approaches to these states cannot be wholly oppositional. As we see with China, for example, it is very important, as our leaders have made clear, that we try to seek common agreement and pursuit of common interests where we can, and no less can be said of Russia and indeed Iran, with whom we do seek a negotiated settlement to the many challenges between us. But as I indicated before, one needs to get appropriate answers from them out of these, and agreements that in fact meet security needs. And this is a hard thing to do, but it's also clear that, as Secretary Pompeo has said of China, we need to deal with China as it is, not as we wish it would be. And I think that's true of both Russia and Iran as well. The intrinsically revisionist nature of their geopolitics that derive from the needs of their grievance ideologies at home help make this a special challenge. It is not necessarily an insurmountable one, but I think it is one that cannot be met unless we recognize it for the challenge that it is. And that's part of what I'm trying to encourage people to focus upon. How to build and maintain effective competitive strategies against such states, I think, is the core challenge of foreign and national security policymaking in this era. And it is one in which we will need lots of help from thoughtful people, such as the think tankers at places like INSS. And so it makes me extra glad to be able to talk to you today, and I thank you for your patience in listening to me drone on here. So thanks very much. I'm not sure how you want to do this, so up to you.
Yeah, I mean, we can do it directly now. I think that's
Okay, sure.
Ines, people have questions. Dr. Ford will be happy to take them. Yeah, Andre.
The mic work. Okay, I can just speak up.
Yeah, speak up.
Everybody hear me? Thank you very much for the speech, Dr. Ford, and I really enjoyed your opening statement on grievances states. Andrei Baklitsky, Russian Center for Policy Studies, Moscow. It's very ironic, while coming from someone from administration who is actually the most grieving administration in all recent U.S. history, craving to make America great again, complaining about humiliations of U.S. from both allies and competitors, accusing foreigners of all the ills of the country, and very telling, you spent all of the speech basically grieving about Russia, China, and Iran. And you also should probably know better than complaining about Russia providing Iran with a light water reactor, which is under IAEA safeguards, and Russia takes back spent nuclear fuel, and basically there is zero proliferation risk there. But I also have a question. In your speech, you touched upon three countries which you see as revisionist and which cause a lot of non-proliferation issues. You have not touched on DPRK, which is clearer non-proliferation threat, but for some reason you haven't touched upon that. Is there a reason for that, and can you maybe speak a little bit on U.S. approach to DPRK? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, clearly the North Korean challenge to the non-proliferation regime is absolutely fundamental. It's the the poster child for a country that purported to be part of the NPT regime, doesn't appear to have complied with the NPT, even at the point it signed it and was caught in violation, and upon being caught, announced its withdrawal from the treaty, and then, of course, proceeded to develop both intercontinental ballistic missiles and the weapons to put atop them. Huge problem. Nothing I said should in any way diminish the seriousness with which Washington takes that. I simply did not think that they fit into quite the same typology of a grievance state that I was describing, in part because there is, at least to my eye, much less in North Korean propaganda of an effort to sort of recreate past glories of which they feel they were robbed. They aim to create some kind of a mystical vision of future glory, and they have all kinds of weird, symbolic and quasi-religious associations with the ruling dynasty and glorious dreams of the future. But that's not quite the same thing as looking back as the PRC does in its legitimacy narrative to, Tang or Ming or sort of ancient dynastic precedents as something of which China was robbed, and it needs to be sort of restored in the present day. It's not the same thing as Putin's 1999 manifesto upon coming to power, in which he sort of looks back upon the post-Cold War era and regards the catastrophe of the collapse of the Soviet Union as something that clearly needs to be rectified in some fashion. And it's not the same thing as Iranian ideologists looking back upon dynasties and caliphates of years past as a model to sort of recreate in its own sort of politicized Shiite guise in the present day. So clearly a huge problem, slightly different typology, slightly different circumstances, but please don't think I'm minimizing that problem. We are working on that one very, very hard.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris Ford. Benjamin Haute Couverture from the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris. Thank you very much for trying to put these things in perspective, and especially the notion of grievance states, which is very interesting, I think. The need for enemies, specifically. Don't you think it is something largely shared by many states in history? Do not take it the wrong way, but we in France, and I think in academics in Europe, elsewhere, we do study security and foreign policy of the United States in the 20th as a particular policy, always in the need for foreign enemies to justify it. Not for justifying autocratic regime, of course, but for justify its policy. So I think this is something I would like to have your idea on as a factor of the US, specific US foreign policy. Second point is, what about, in your opinion, this, I think, relevant idea of security dilemmas and action-reaction dynamics? You did not mention it as a factor of growing tensions between US and Russia, and to some extent with China. But it is also a reason, I would say, whatever the exact origin of the dynamic. And for instance, and we all know that, but I think we have to mention it in our discussions today and tomorrow, of course. What's about the US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002, for instance? Because we know, maybe it's a different thing, but we know that in the perception, in the speeches, in the positions of China and Russia, they have been insisting on this for 17 years now. And more specifically now, my question to you is, do you think that strategic dialogue with China and with Russia still is a relevant tool for the time being? Because the 2018 nuclear posture review, for instance, calls for strategic dialogue with both countries. But are China and Russia, in your opinion, still keen on strategic dialogue? And if they are not, they are not. Then dialogue meant for a better understanding between states is and will be useless in the foreseeable future. Then the only way will be negotiating compromises, difficult compromises in each specific case. So what do you think? Do you think strategic dialogue is still a relevant tool, diplomatic tool with China or Russia, or is it over?
The short answer, there's a lot to unpack in that.
Sorry.
The very short answer to the last bit is yes, I and we do believe it is still relevant. Let me back up a little bit in a couple of your comments. On the need for enemies, I would argue very much that in the US narrative, the need for enemies is nowhere near central to the domestic conceptions of how the system works as it is, for example, in the ideology of the Putin regime, which, this is a fellow who has described domestic dissenters as, as bacilli that need to be eradicated from the body lest they cause, some kind of dangerous disease. That kind of, and the centrality of that kind of imagery to the maintenance of domestic order and indeed the survival of the regime, that is in no way present in the United States, thank goodness. We tend to be very fiercely attached to what you might call our socio-political operating system. We believe in the tenets of our Constitution and the sovereign political authority of the people expressed democratically in the rights-based system of how it is exercised, and we get very touchy when we feel that is under threat, including from the outside, but that's a slightly different phenomenon. So let me distinguish that. On the ABM treaty, I think the distinguishing point there is that in some ways that is a model of how we creditably approach international commitments. The problem from our perspective with the ABM treaty is that it disabled us from responding to third-party threats that emerged in ways that were not foreseen at the time the treaty was established. And if we were Russians, I suppose we would have decided simply to covertly violate the ABM treaty while building what we thought we needed against North Korea and Iran, and then pretend that we hadn't. We don't work that way, and so we felt compelled to do it the proper way, which is to say, give our notice under the treaty of our intent to withdraw for reasons that are important to our national security. It wasn't actually about the Russian counterparties in the treaty. It was about third parties, but the treaty was structured in a way that prohibited us from responding to those threats. And oh, by the way, those threats are keyed to the revisionist geopolitics of Iran, at least, and whatever you can describe North Korean politics as having been. So there's a distinction there that I think also perhaps shines some light back onto the grievance state construct. But very, very quickly at the end, yes, great relevance to strategic dialogue. We have been very straightforward and clear. Our president has been very clear about the importance of finding a future for arms control that is trilateral. It is not merely a double down and try again harder to address the same old Cold War style bilateral issues. This is not that world. It is not that world partly for good reasons, because it is not that world in part because both we and the Russians have come down in our nuclear arsenals enormously since our Cold War peaks. On the US side, I think it's something like 88% reduction. We used to have scores of thousands of weapons, and so did Moscow. And neither one of us is anywhere near that now, and that's a good thing. So that's one reason why old-style bilateralism is not quite the answer, because our position relative to the rest of the world is decreased, which makes the salience of other holdings elsewhere greater. The other reason is not so good, and that is that China is steadily building up. The PRC is on track to at least double the size of its nuclear arsenal within the next 10 years. And there is no imaginable way that you can envision a future for arms control that does not somehow take into account that reality. So our vision is of trilateral arms control, and you don't get there without engaging with the other parties. You don't get there without dialogue, and we're hoping very much to begin to initiate that kind of engagement as soon as possible.
Trump administration, in responding to the destruction of U.S. drone, the attack on Saudi oil fields, and 4 consecutive violations of Iran of the nuclear deal over a period of 8 months, has been, according to most, relatively muted. Additional sanctions, but nothing that's really changed Iran's behavior. Short of military force, and maybe that's the answer, in whatever version. How is the Trump administration actually going to get Iran to change its behavior?
What we are doing with the maximum pressure campaign is to put as much constraint as we can upon Iran's behavior. That does not preclude it acting out. In the short term, I think it does present more fundamental structural constraints upon what they can do. Whereas a couple of years ago, under the JCPOA, you saw boastful media comments from Iranian proxies in the region, for example, about how they were assured of having all the money they want because Iran will always provide us with money. That was under the JCPOA. Now, under the burden of the sanctions and pressures that we have put upon the Iranian regime, you hear not so boastful public comments complaining about how the Iranians are cutting back that supply of money. And that is one example, but I do think that we are, through this pressure campaign, making it notably harder for Iran to continue doing the kind of rampant destabilization of the regime, of the region that it has become so infamous for doing. That doesn't mean that it will behave smoothly in being constrained. It is to some degree perhaps feeling cornered, and that is always a dangerous place to put someone. On the other hand, the very fact that it is cornered is testament to the fact that we're doing, I think, a pretty good job in putting it in the place where it faces a fundamental strategic choice. It can continue to live under, it sort of has three choices, I suppose. It can continue to live under these kinds of pressures indefinitely. It can act out even worse and perhaps precipitate even more dramatic responses, which would probably not be in its interest, if I might be so bold as to say. Or it can come to the table as we wish it to do and reach an agreement with us that settles these many problems between us. And we've been very clear about what we are offering in this. The alternative to a indefinite future of this kind of crushing pressure is one in which we are willing to put on the table what no U.S. administration has done before. Secretary Pompeo has explicitly offered not just a relief of all sanctions against Iran, but he has offered a restoration of diplomatic relations and the kind of cooperative relationship that one has with normal states. Now, that's not easy to come by, because in order to get that, you have to behave as a normal state, and there is not much chance in the immediate future of Iran being willing to do that, but we hope that it will come around to that choice. And if it does, there is a lot that we are willing to offer it. That's the choice that it has to make, and we can't make it make that choice, but we can put it in circumstances in which it has every incentive to make the correct one. Maybe it won't, but I certainly hope so, and that's the focus of our policy. And I've taken lots of your time.
I think we maybe have time for one more question.
Yeah, just asking, you said that the arms control is, I think the arms control order is breaking out in the last few years, because all of the agreements, the bilateral agreements that you have with the Russians are, you ended them, or the Russians are not. And you said that the only way to bring arms control back to the stage maybe is trilateral. But I think, and you're wishing for a dialogue, but I think if we look at the history, arms control constructions only came when there was a catastrophe. I think that's where we're going. If you look to India and Pakistan, or look to North Korea or other places, only way that all the actors will get together and bring a new order is after a catastrophe, or where a catastrophe is very close. Do you agree, or do you have other rationality to go to bring something else to the table?
I would say that I like to think, and I think it's probably true, that the international community is capable of learning. When the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, we had no lessons to draw upon, and thankfully we're able to learn from it, and that was indeed a catalyst for starting the two superpowers thinking about how to find an arms control relationship between them that would be a way to help manage the dangers and risks of escalation and that sort of thing in their relationship. But that doesn't mean that every power that is in a nuclear relationship with another power has to have a catastrophe before being able to look back and read history books and discover that that was actually a good idea. We don't have to relearn all these things for ourselves. That's one of the nice things about history, is one can study it and learn from it. And I hope that people are able and willing to do that. I do think that the history of how it is that arms control agreements and transparency and confidence building measures and learning enough about each other to be able to exist more stably, and they're always dangerous, but more stably in a deterrent relationship. Those are things that we took a long time to do with our Soviet counterparts, because we were sort of making this up, the two of us, as we went along. But no one else has to make this up. They can learn from where we were. The nuclear deterrence partners, if you will, in South Asia, for example, can look at the history of how NATO struggled for many years with the challenge of the stability impact and the controllability of small forward deployed battlefield weapons. We ultimately decided that was a terrible idea. We thought it was a great idea until we realized it wasn't. And through gaming and exploration of these challenges and hard study, we began to realize that in fact what we had planned to do with very small forward deployed devices like there's this thing called the Davy Crockett. It was more or less in the back of a Jeep. It could fire a nuclear weapon a very short distance away. We had a system of deployed, we had a posture in Europe that we realized after a while was not in fact a good posture, and we moved away from that. The fact that we had to go through that, and thank goodness we didn't have a crisis on the inter-German border during that time, but the fact that we moved away from that posture can be a lesson for South Asia. The fact that all of these things have been done, and the fact that there is such a legacy of arms control negotiation and thoughtful, constructive thinking about how to manage these kinds of challenges and to achieve risk reduction, all these things are things that others can learn from. So I don't think we have to wait for a catastrophe. I think there's plenty to learn from and to work with, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do. No one's done trilateral nuclear arms control before, but I don't have any illusions that, well, of course it's not going to be easy, but I don't think we have to make this up from scratch and await a trilateral catastrophe in order to have those talks. I think we're ready for them now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.